Mara awoke to a cold room filled with strange lights and the heavy sound of machines. She was strapped into a cradle made of alien metal, the kind that shifted and clamped tighter every time she tried to move. The smell of ozone and disinfectant stung her nose. Above her floated the sharp figure of Vorax, the chief interrogator of the Keth Directorate. His many eyes glittered with confidence as he leaned close to inspect her. He told her that humans were fragile creatures, that they broke quickly under pressure, and that her secrets would not remain hidden for long. Mara did not flinch. She tilted her head, studying him the way a teacher studies a student, and asked him where the manual was because she would like to correct the errors. In his methods, the guards laughed, uncertain if she was mocking or insane, but Vorax frowned, intrigued by the calmness in her voice. The first session began with a machine that sent waves of energy through her nerves. She gritted her teeth, rode the burn, and then spoke between breaths, explaining that the frequency was poorly tuned, that too much repetition would only create tolerance. Vorax blinked as she told him his own methods were inefficient, and that if he wanted results, he needed variety. His assistants looked at one another, confused. This was not how it was supposed to go. Prisoners screamed, begged, pleaded. But this human was giving advice as if she were a consultant, not a victim. Mara's mind worked like a blade. She knew she could not resist forever, not by brute force, so she chose another path. She would become indispensable. She would make them need her knowledge, and in doing so, she would turn the tables. Every glance she took mattered. She counted the blinking of cameras, noted which guards leaned to the left, which used their dominant hand. She memorized the time it took for the door to cycle, and the pattern of lights that flashed when the machines spooled up. When Vorax demanded to know what she meant by tolerance, she gave him a small lecture about how the human body adapted quickly to predictable stress, that by introducing random variables, they could actually keep a subject alive longer without losing consciousness. He was fascinated against his will, scribbling notes with one claw. Mara smiled weakly and asked for water. She was given a cup, something no other prisoner received. That single gesture told her she was on the right track. Over the next hours, she let them think they were the ones leading. She explained breathing techniques that allowed her to control heart rate. She told them about posture, how keeping the spine aligned reduced nerve collapse. She did not reveal that every piece of advice helped her endure far longer than they expected. By giving them tools, she built her own armor. They started recording her explanations as if she were an expert, and soon Vorax introduced her to Sari, a younger technician, eager but doubtful. Sari's eyes showed guilt whenever the machines powered up, and Mara caught that weakness. She offered Sari small smiles and quiet words about how science was meant to understand. Not only to harm, Sari began slipping her tiny favors, a softer cushion for her seat, an extra sip of water. The Keth Directorate overseer arrived tall and cruel. He demanded results, and Vorax proudly showed Mara's data charts. Her endurance levels broke previous records, and the overseer was both impressed and unsettled. Never had a human lasted so long. Mara pretended to be tired, but inside she was building maps and plans. She could see the lines of division forming between the interrogators, the ambitious Vorax, the doubtful Sari, and the harsh overseer. She would use these cracks to shatter the entire operation. When the overseer left, Mara leaned close to Vorax and whispered that his tools were still flawed. She told him the neural rake was on the wrong frequency, that he would never reach the depth of human resistance unless he changed the settings. Vorax hesitated, then ordered the adjustment. When the new wave struck, Mara's body arched, but she steadied her breath and rode the agony. Her eyes stayed locked on his multiple lenses, and he saw not fear but control. She whispered, "You will need me more than I need you." The room grew silent because in that moment everyone felt it, even the guards. This was not a prisoner being broken. This was a teacher beginning her class by the end of that first day. Mara was still bound, but she had planted the first seeds of doubt in their minds. She had turned pain into a lesson and fear into a game she was determined to win. She knew her survival depended on her ability to guide her captors down a path they did not realize they were taking, and so she closed her eyes, breathing slowly as the machines powered down, already planning the next lesson. already thinking about how to turn this laboratory of cruelty into her own classroom. The next cycle began with Mara being pulled from her cradle and placed in a chair, a rare privilege meant to encourage her cooperation. She stretched her arms slightly as the restraints locked in and allowed herself the faintest sigh of relief for the change in posture. Vorax paced in front of her reading notes aloud, as if lecturing his own staff. He declared that the subject had shown remarkable endurance, but that now they would test her adaptability. Mara tilted her head and asked if he wanted her to explain how humans adapted faster when their environment was unpredictable. His hesitation was brief before he waved for the machines to activate. The first surge came from a new device, a cluster of needles vibrating at high frequency, meant to overstimulate her nerves. Mara inhaled sharply, then steadied her breath. She spoke slowly, describing how the pain would spike and then dull because the nerves would burn out. She told them if they truly wanted lasting results, they needed to alternate between heat, cold, and vibration so that the body could not adjust. Vorax scribbled her words down while the assistants exchanged uncertain glances. Mara saw it. She saw how they leaned toward her. Not him, because her voice carried knowledge, not orders, and she knew knowledge had power even here. Between trials, she was given a thin data slate to record feedback. This was supposed to help them refine procedures, but Mara used it for something else. She began to draw diagrams of the human body, marking nerve clusters and pressure points. But she exaggerated, some while minimizing others. Anyone who studied carefully might realize her charts could be used to defend rather than destroy. Sari lingered near her shoulder, and Mara spoke softly, pointing out how the body healed faster with proper hydration and rest. She suggested that subjects be treated with care between sessions so results would be more consistent. Sari's brow furrowed, but she nodded and later returned with a cup of water laced with minerals. Mara drank and whispered her thanks. The overseer visited again, demanding harsher trials, claiming Mara was manipulating them. Vorax defended her, explaining that her input had already doubled their data yield. The overseer sneered but left a warning that if results did not lead to breakthroughs, the lab would be shut down. Mara listened closely to the tension in his voice. He was under pressure too, and pressure made cracks grow wider. She smiled faintly at Vorax and told him that sometimes leadership required trust rather than force. He bristled but did not deny the impact her presence had already made. During the following session, Mara requested harmless objects under the guise of improving study accuracy. She asked for a cloth to wipe sweat so they could monitor skin changes. She requested a mirror so she could observe her own reactions and a metronome to measure her breathing rhythms. Each item seemed innocent, but together they were tools. The mirror allowed her to watch reflections of codes being tapped into security panels. The metronome gave her a rhythm to focus on and to mask subtle finger taps to herself. She began to practice hand signals under the cloth, as if stretching. Vorax noted how her endurance exceeded projections and even praised her before the staff, which unsettled everyone. A prisoner should not be praised, yet she earned it by demonstrating control. Sari lingered again, whispering during a machine reset, asking how Mara stayed calm. Mara looked at her and explained that calmness was a choice that pain could not take away unless you surrendered it. She told Sari that humans learned long ago to face storms by breathing through them, and that lesson could belong to anyone. Sari's eyes softened, and Mara knew she had gained a quiet ally. By the end of the second cycle, Mara had transformed the atmosphere in the chamber. What began as a place of terror was turning into a classroom of sorts where the interrogators hung on her words and the technicians adjusted their machines. According to her suggestions, the guards even watched with something like curiosity instead of cruelty. They still held power over her body, but she was beginning to seize control over their minds. She realized she was laying the foundation of something greater than survival. She was shaping loyalty and sowing doubt among her captors. She could feel the balance of control shifting just slightly in her favor, and she promised herself she would keep pushing until the whole room belonged to her, not to the directorate. Mara woke with the soft vibration of machinery around her, and for a moment she allowed herself to pretend she was back in a human laboratory where people worked together for knowledge instead of cruelty. She opened her eyes and found Vorax waiting with an unusual expression. He no longer looked at her only as a prisoner, but as something more valuable. Today, he announced they would be conducting a workshop of sorts to improve efficiency. Mara raised her brows as if she were pleased and told him that if he wanted his staff to truly learn, then the room should be treated like a classroom, not a cell. He hesitated but gave the order, and soon the guards and technicians gathered close, watching her as though she were the instructor, and they were the students. Mara stood this time, her restraints loosened to allow her arms some movement under the pretense of demonstration. She began to explain the basics of human anatomy using her body as a model. She pointed to nerves that carried sensation muscles that locked under stress and veins that flushed with adrenaline. The staff scribbled notes quickly while she carefully exaggerated some details and minimized others, ensuring that anyone who studied her diagrams would unknowingly be armed with methods to resist rather than to inflict. She showed how breathing could redirect focus and how posture could spread pain evenly until it dulled. She then surprised them all by asking a guard to step forward. She guided his hand to her arm and showed how simple pressure created numbness in fingers. This was not weakness, she explained, but adaptation, and they murmured with awe at her composure. She requested the cloth again along with the mirror and the metronome, claiming these items were vital to demonstrate control. The cloth allowed her to stretch her hands in secret. The mirror let her watch security panels and technicians' lips as they spoke codes, and the metronome became her silent partner. She tapped her finger in rhythm hidden from sight, training herself to signal later when the moment came. Each item seemed harmless, but in her hands they became stepping stones toward freedom. The staff began to argue amongst themselves about methods. One technician believed constant stress broke subjects faster. Another repeated Mara's teaching that too much predictability built tolerance. Vorax silenced them, but Mara could see his pride. He wanted to be known as the interrogator who revolutionized the field, and she was giving him tools for that ambition. She leaned into this weakness. She praised him for allowing knowledge to flourish under his command. She asked questions designed to make him think he was guiding her, when in truth she was guiding him. She watched as the power dynamic shifted ever more subtly, until her voice carried equal weight with his. Sari stayed near Mara throughout the day, eyes full of conflict. Mara knew she could not press too hard yet, so she gently encouraged Sari by telling stories of human healers who treated enemies on battlefields. She described compassion as strength, not weakness, and saw the flicker of belief spark. In Sari's eyes, the young technician adjusted the restraints for Mara in a way that left the faintest gap at the wrist unnoticed by others. That gap became another seed for escape, and Mara silently vowed she would not waste it. By the end of the workshop, the chamber no longer felt like a torture hall. It had become something else, a place where ideas flowed, where the interrogators competed to impress their human subject, and where Mara had transformed from captive to instructor. The overseer had not witnessed this shift, and Mara intended to use that blindness when the time was right. She sat back in her chair, exhausted but triumphant, knowing that the more they saw her as a teacher, the less they could ever see her as broken. When the guards carried her back to her cell, she allowed her body to sag as if defeated, but inside her mind burned with calculation. She now possessed codes glimpsed through the mirror patterns memorized from the technicians' mouths and a wrist restraint that could be undone with careful effort. She had a loyal spark in Sari and a prideful weakness in Vorax. She had turned fear into fascination and cruelty into curiosity. The laboratory was still a prison, but with every word she spoke, it was becoming her classroom, and in classrooms it was always the teacher who held the true power. The next rotation of the lab came with a power fluctuation that dimmed the lights for several seconds, and in those precious moments Mara acted. She had practiced every night, moving her fingers against the cloth and timing her breaths with the steady rhythm of the metronome. Now, with the gap in her wrist, restraint, and the cover of darkness, she slipped her hand free only long enough to slide a tiny device from the maintenance cart into her palm. It was nothing more than a patch meant to loop bio readings, but in her hands it was the first tool of freedom. She pressed it against her chest so the monitors would show a steady heartbeat, even if she moved differently. She quickly resecured the strap before the lights returned, and when the technicians glanced at her screen, they saw nothing unusual. Over the next hours, she made her move more daring. During one of the sessions, she coughed violently and demanded water. When the guard turned his back, she leaned to the side and tapped the patch 3 times. The screen showed her vitals unchanged, and that confirmed her deception worked. Now she could act without being caught every time a machine strained her body. She also used the opportunity to exchange chemicals in the storage cabinet. She replaced sedatives with saline, letting her mind remain sharp when they thought she was dulled. She knew she could not escape in one bold strike. The Directorate facility was layered with barriers, drones, and walls that sealed like jaws. Instead, she worked like a teacher shaping lessons. She sabotaged one of the pain amplifiers, subtly loosening a core so it failed mid-demonstration. The Overseer stormed into the chamber, furious, demanding answers. Vorax defended Mara, insisting she had predicted the flaw and prevented worse damage. The Overseer left unconvinced, but Mara smiled because she had created distrust, not in herself, but in the equipment, and that seed of doubt weakened their foundation. Sari grew braver in her small kindnesses. She lingered longer near Mara after each session, whispering questions about human endurance and ethics. Mara answered softly, telling her about soldiers who had resisted capture by focusing on memories of family. She spoke of strength drawn from connection, not fear, and saw Sari's eyes widen as if she had never considered such things before. When Mara asked if there were others locked deeper within the facility, Sari hesitated, then admitted there were prisoners from other worlds hidden in sealed cells. The words struck Mara like fire. She realized her fight was no longer about her survival alone. She now carried the responsibility of every soul trapped in the Directorate's cages. That night she plotted carefully. The phantom saboteur story she had planted was gaining traction among the staff, who whispered that a rival faction wanted to discredit them. She decided to feed that rumor, leaving subtle evidence of tampering in corners where only inspectors would find it. The audits slowed schedules, giving her more windows to observe patterns. She saw which guards took longer breaks, who lingered by certain doors, and which codes were reused across multiple panels. With each observation, her map of the facility grew clearer in her mind. Vorax noticed her increasing confidence and confronted her, demanding to know why she still smiled, despite everything. She looked him in the eye and told him that true strength was not the ability to cause pain, but to endure it and to teach from it. He bristled, but he did not argue because part of him believed her. He was beginning to see her not as an enemy, but as a source of wisdom. And Mara knew that if she could turn him fully, the balance of power in the chamber would tilt completely. By the end of that cycle, Mara had pulled off her first invisible escape. She had freed one hand, tested her patch, swapped their chemicals, and seeded doubt, all without raising alarms. She returned to her cradle as the machines powered down and closed her eyes. Not as a prisoner, but as a strategist. Every lesson she had given was now a weapon. Every kindness she had inspired was now a crack in the wall. She whispered silently to herself that this was only the beginning, because the classroom she had created would soon become a battlefield. And when that moment came, she would not be alone. The next phase of Mara's plan began not with a machine or an order, but with her own suggestion. She told Vorax that if he wanted to prevent further equipment failures, then he needed to dedicate one entire cycle to teaching his staff proper technique. He hesitated, but ambition won, and he agreed. A training day was announced in the chamber, filled with guards and technicians who expected a lecture from their chief. Instead, Mara stood in the center, her restraints loose enough to move her arms, and the room fell into silence. She began not with pain, but with questions. She asked each person why they had joined the Directorate. Some answered with pride in science, others muttered about duty, and one or two stayed silent. Mara let the silence stretch until it became heavier than the machines. She told them that pain without purpose was waste, and that endurance without meaning was nothing more than cruelty. She shared a story from human history of a medic who treated both friend and foe on a battlefield, saying that mercy had changed the tide more than any weapon. Her voice carried not as a prisoner but as a teacher, and the staff leaned closer as though her words were answers they had long sought. When she demonstrated techniques, she did not scream or resist. Instead, she showed how breath could steady the mind, how focus could turn agony into distance. She asked for a volunteer, and Sari stepped forward. Hesitant, Mara guided her through a simple posture exercise and explained how even a prisoner could decide whether pain would matter. That moment changed the atmosphere because the staff no longer looked at Mara as an object, but as someone who offered them knowledge. Vorax watched tight-jawed, knowing he was losing control of his own chamber, but also unwilling to stop because every word from Mara drew the room deeper under her influence. The overseer arrived mid-demonstration, demanding harsher results. He ordered the machines to be pushed to maximum and accused Mara of manipulation. Mara stood tall, her eyes unflinching, and said that what he asked would only kill the subject without yielding insight. She turned to the staff and asked them whether they wanted to be remembered as scientists or as butchers. The words hit hard. Several shifted uneasily. Sari spoke aloud for the first time, insisting that data was only valuable if it led to understanding, not destruction. The overseer's fury rose, but Vorax held him back, torn between loyalty and the truth. He could no longer ignore. Mara seized the moment. She explained that endurance was not about breaking bones, but about breaking limits. She showed them how controlled exposure revealed thresholds and how pushing past those thresholds made subjects useless. She framed it as science, but her eyes locked on each technician, asking them silently to choose what kind of people they wanted to be. The chamber trembled not from machines but from doubt spreading like fire in dry grass. By the end of the session, Mara had transformed the training day into a turning point. The staff left with questions they had never asked, themselves and loyalties that no longer pointed in one direction. Sari lingered at her side openly now. Speaking of change and choice, Vorax dismissed the group with harsh words, but his voice cracked with uncertainty. The overseer stormed out, swearing he would end the experiment if results faltered. Yet Mara knew she had already planted something that no order could erase. When she was escorted back to her cell, the guards did not jeer or shove. They looked at her with a strange respect, perhaps, even fear. She had stood in the heart of the directorate's chamber and forced them to see that their power was hollow. She had given them a glimpse of another path, and that vision could not be unseen. She leaned against the cold wall of her cell, whispering to herself that the class had begun, and soon the entire facility would be her students whether they wished it or not. The alarms began without warning. A deep rising wail that shook the metal walls and cast the entire facility into chaos. Red lights flashed and drones swept through the corridors as doors sealed and systems reset. Mara knew this was not random. Her planted evidence of sabotage had finally borne fruit. The directorate believed a rival faction had infiltrated the site, and the purge protocols were underway. In that confusion, she acted. The guard who came to secure her cell found the restraints already loose. Sari had arrived minutes earlier, eyes filled with determination and trembling hands. She whispered that she could not allow the overseer to destroy more lives. Mara grasped her shoulder firmly and told her that strength was choosing to act, even when afraid. Together they disabled the monitor feeds, using the patch Mara had stolen days before. It looped, her vitals across every station showing a compliant subject, while in truth she was already on her feet. They moved into the corridor where the noise of alarms masked their footsteps. Mara used the rhythm of the metronome she had practiced for weeks, counting beats in her mind to guide their movement. They timed their steps with the blare of sirens and the hiss of doors, creating a pattern that let them slip past drones without drawing attention. Every second of her classroom training now served as fieldwork. The students had unknowingly prepared her for this moment. In the lower levels, Mara found the sealed cells. Sari worked quickly with codes she had stolen during long nights at the consoles. Each door hissed open, releasing prisoners from dozens of species. Some stumbled weak and broken. Others still had fire in their eyes. Mara raised her hands and spoke clearly, telling them to move with silence and unity, not to rush, not to break formation. She explained that the only path to freedom was to act as one. The prisoners listened because in her stance and tone there was no hesitation. She had become commander as much as teacher. Meanwhile, Vorax confronted the overseer in the control chamber. The overseer ordered him to purge the cells and destroy all evidence. Vorax hesitated, the image of Mara's words echoing in his mind. He had wanted glory, but now he saw truth, that strength was not in cruelty, but in endurance. When the overseer moved to activate the purge, Vorax struck his hand away. The two clashed violently, each driven by pride, but Vorax's hesitation fell away as he realized what he had learned from the human. He blocked the overseer's weapon with his own claws, declaring that knowledge gained through cruelty was weakness, not power. Mara led the group through the corridors, directing them with hand signals. She used cloth strips as flags and mirror reflections to guide them around patrols. Every lesson she had given about focus and adaptation now kept the prisoners steady. They moved like shadows past automated turrets, and when a drone nearly discovered them, Mara threw a stolen injector into its sensor bank, blinding it long enough for the group to pass. She did not fight with rage, but with precision, shaped by weeks of observation. The final push brought them to the relay chamber. The heart of the facility, Mara ordered the prisoners into defensive positions, while Sari linked consoles to broadcast. She fed the Directorate's own records into the open network, the recordings of torture, the charts of human endurance, the footage of Mara teaching her captors. The truth spread instantly across the channels of rival powers and sympathetic groups. The secret site was no longer hidden. Rescue forces, both human and alien, began converging on the coordinates drawn by the signal. The overseer burst into the relay chamber, wounded from his fight with Vorax, but still dangerous. He raised his weapon toward Mara, shouting that she was nothing more than a fragile creature daring to defy an empire. Vorax staggered in behind him, blocking the shot with his own body. He told Mara that he finally understood her lesson, that strength was not found in domination, but in standing for others. Mara stepped forward and disarmed the overseer with a single precise move, driving him to the floor. The chamber filled with the faces of freed prisoners who looked at her not with pity, but with reverence. The alarms continued, but now they sounded less like threats and more like drums of change. The black site was no longer under Directorate control. It belonged to the prisoners and to the human who had turned her own torment into a classroom. Mara stood in the relay chamber, breathing steadily. As the signal carried her voice across the galaxy, she did not declare vengeance. She declared survival, unity, and the end of cruelty, disguised as science. And as the strike forces closed in, the once broken captive had become the leader of an uprising that would shatter the Directorate's chains forever. The storm ended not with silence, but with the thunder of ships descending outside the facility. The signal Mara and Sari had sent into the network had spread faster than anyone imagined drawing. Human strike teams and even vessels from species who had long feared to speak against the Directorate. The corridors echoed with the clash of boots and weapons as the last loyal guards fell back or surrendered. Mara stood among the prisoners in the relay chamber, her body weary but her eyes sharp. She refused to collapse because she knew her work was not finished. When the human strike commander entered the chamber, he froze at the sight of her, free and unbowed. Mara stepped forward, not as a rescued captive, but as the leader of those she had freed. She told him that evacuation could not begin until every prisoner was accounted for and every record preserved. The commander started to argue, but her voice carried such authority that even soldiers accustomed to command found themselves listening. She handed him the data logs Sari had compiled, proof of the Directorate's crimes that would ignite outrage across the stars. Vorax stood nearby, his body scarred from the fight with the overseer. He did not beg for mercy. He lowered his head and admitted that he had learned more about strength from a human prisoner than from a lifetime of manuals. He offered to testify against the Directorate to expose every hidden site, every practice meant to break the will of others. Mara studied him for a long moment before nodding. She told him that redemption began with truth, not excuses, and he accepted her words with something close to reverence. The overseer was dragged into the chamber, bound and furious. He spat threats at Mara, promising that the Directorate would never fall. Mara met his eyes and said calmly that fear was his only weapon, and that fear had already lost. The prisoners behind her raised their voices not in anger but in unity, shouting their defiance. The overseer's rage faltered when he realized he had no power left, because those he had tormented now stood together stronger than any order he could give. As the last cells were opened, Mara personally walked each prisoner to the extraction point. She spoke to them gently, telling them to hold their heads high because survival was not shameful, but a victory of its own. She reminded them that endurance was strength, and that their voices would now carry farther than any scream of pain ever had. Sari moved beside her, silent but steady, and Mara placed a hand on her shoulder, calling her courageous for choosing compassion over obedience. When the transports lifted into orbit, Mara watched through the viewport as the black site shrank behind them, a fortress of cruelty reduced to an empty husk. She felt no triumph, only a deep certainty that something greater had begun. She knew the Directorate would retaliate, but she also knew the galaxy had seen the truth. The footage of her teaching her captors had already spread, and people everywhere were questioning what they had once accepted as unchangeable law. Back on the human flagship, Mara was offered medical care and honors, but she declined both until she was certain every prisoner was safe. She walked through the medbay, speaking to survivors of many worlds, assuring them that they were not forgotten, that they were part of something larger now. A coalition was already forming of species once divided by fear, now united by the example of one human who had refused to break. In the weeks that followed, the tribunal hearings began. The Mara Standard, as it came to be called, set strict limits on interrogation and custody across allied worlds. The Directorate protested, but the tide of opinion was against them. Too many voices had seen the evidence. Too many hearts had been stirred by the image of a human prisoner calmly teaching her torturers how to do their job while turning them into her students instead of her masters. When Mara finally returned to Earth, she carried no banners and accepted no titles. She returned to her modest home and placed the old metronome on a shelf. She let it tick for a moment, then stopped it with her hand, smiling softly, because she no longer needed the rhythm to steady her breath. The beat of endurance had been given to others now, and it would echo across the stars long after her own voice faded. Her story did not end with vengeance or despair. It ended with a quiet victory, the kind that reshaped laws and lives and made empires tremble, not through force of arms but through the strength of the human spirit. The galaxy would remember the woman who turned torture into lessons, who turned cruelty into compassion, and who proved that humanity's greatest weapon was not pain resistance alone, but the power to teach even in the darkest chamber. The days after the tribunal carried the weight of change across the galaxy, and Mara found herself no longer a subject of whispers, but a symbol. Her name was spoken in stations and colonies where people had once bowed their heads in fear, and now stood taller because they believed in endurance and unity. The Mara Standard spread like fire, carved into treaties and enforced by coalitions that had once hesitated to defy the Directorate, but now saw no choice but to act. The Directorate faltered not from a single battle, but from the loss of the fear that had once held so many worlds. Silent, Mara did not remain at the center of politics, though she was invited and even begged to sit on councils. Instead, she chose a quieter path. She visited hospitals where survivors of the black sites recovered, and she spoke with them, not as a hero but as one who had endured as they had. She reminded them that survival was strength, and that healing was a victory no less important than rebellion. She taught children of different species simple breathing exercises, lessons she had once used herself in the chamber, and she told them that control belonged to them always. Vorax appeared at the tribunal once more, scarred and stripped of rank, yet his voice was steady when he confessed the crimes of the Directorate. He gave details of hidden sites and procedures, and when asked why he betrayed his own command, he answered that a human prisoner had taught him the truth of strength. His testimony toppled walls of secrecy, and Mara knew that even broken loyalty could become a tool for justice. Sari stood beside him, no longer timid but resolute, and she became a witness for compassion, her defection inspiring others who had once thought obedience their only path. Mara returned at last to the quiet home she had left behind. Her walls bore no banners of triumph, only shelves, filled with books and simple tools. She placed the metronome in the center of the room and let it tick once more. For a moment, she listened to the rhythm that had carried her through agony, and she smiled before gently stopping it. The silence that followed was not emptiness but peace. She no longer needed the device because the beat had become part of countless others across the galaxy, each pulse of courage echoing beyond her reach. As night settled, she stepped outside to watch the stars. Her breath rose in the cool air, and she thought of the faces she had seen in the black site, the prisoners who had walked free, and the captors who had learned unwilling lessons. She thought of the overseer, bound and powerless, of Vorax, who had chosen truth, and of Sari, who had chosen compassion. She thought of the human strike commander who had paused at her voice, and of the galaxy now reshaped by a story no one had expected. She had been taken as a fragile subject and returned as a teacher, whose lessons spanned worlds. The sky above glittered with endless light, and Mara whispered that strength was never the absence of fear, but the refusal to surrender to it. She closed her eyes, knowing that somewhere across the stars, another prisoner, another soul, another child was breathing steady, learning that same lesson and finding power in it. She had no crown, no throne, no title yet. She had changed the course of empires with nothing more than her will, her mind, and her unbroken spirit, and so the tale of Mara ended not in a scream but in quiet strength, not in conquest but in teaching, not in despair but in hope. The galaxy would remember her, not as a victim, but as the human who turned pain into knowledge and cruelty into change. The end.